Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and recognise that their sovereignty was never ceded. Also, as we come together for tonight's discussion, we do so with a commitment to justice, truth, and solidarity with all Indigenous peoples resisting dispossession and oppression. And saying that, of course, our thoughts have to be with the people of Gaza, who are now entering day 682 of Israel's ongoing genocide. I'm honoured to welcome you to this special event hosted by the Jewish Council. We are a proudly independent Jewish organisation committed to human rights and opposing anti-Semitism and racism. We're a group of Jewish academics, lawyers, writers, publishers, and teachers, and we're all volunteers. We rely entirely on grassroots support to sustain our work, so if you're in a position to donate, we deeply appreciate that, and you can find details on our website. And a tiny bit of background about us for anyone who's new to the Jewish Council. The Jewish Council came into existence in February 2024 in the context of Israel's bombardment of Gaza in order to provide an independent Jewish voice to oppose all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and to support Palestinian freedom and justice. The formation of the Jewish Council was not just in response to Israel's extreme military actions. We were also deeply concerned by the weaponization of anti-Semitism by the local Zionist organizations. We see this weaponization when almost every act of solidarity with Palestinian people is deemed anti-Semitic. It means that important criticism of Israel's assault on Gaza is being shut down by false accusations of anti-Semitism and distracting news stories about social cohesion. 22 months into this genocide, our concern about this weaponization has not lessened one bit. And this is why it is so timely and such a privilege to have Rachel Shabi here to talk about her latest book, Off-White, The Truth About Anti-Semitism. Rachel is a journalist and broadcaster whose work has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, The Independent, the New York Review of Books, among many other publications. Her first book, Not the Enemy, Israel's Jews from Arab Lands, received a US National Jewish Book Award, and her latest is Off-White. Rachel will be speaking with the Jewish Council's very own Dr. Max Kaiser. Max is also an expert on anti-Semitism and Australian Jewish history and has a PhD from the University of Melbourne. He is the author of Jewish Anti-Fascism and the False Promise of Settler Colonialism and a co-executive officer of the Jewish Council. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, everyone. And just a little bit about, I guess, the running order for tonight. So Rachel and I will be in conversation for half an hour or so, and then we do invite you to submit questions via our Slido, and I hope that my head is not in the way of that QR code. But yes, hopefully you can do it. Otherwise, you can go to slido.com and put in that code, and then yes, they'll come up magically on my phone, and I can ask some of your questions. So thanks so much, Rachel, for being with us here tonight. We're going to launch straight in. So tell us a bit about yourself and your previous books before you came to write this current one that we're discussing.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you all. And I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past and present. As a visiting writer from London, it's a huge honor to be on lands with such a deep and continuous storytelling tradition that's one of the oldest in the world. So me, first of all, anti-Semitism was not my beat, as I say in the book. This wasn't something that as a journalist, I've been reporting from the UK about human rights and various other political issues, and then was based in Israel, Palestine, and did some reporting there, and around the wider Middle East as well, and then came back to the UK, smack bang in the middle of the act of national self-harm known as Brexit. And then slammed into, I mean, of course, if you report Israel-Palestine, you're going to come up against the political misuse of anti-Semitism. But I hadn't seen it in mainstream British politics in such an overt and distorted and hyperbolic way until we got a radical left leader with Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. And the whole dynamics of that, the misuse, the distortion, the bad faith, the bad reactions from the left me thinking, well, wow, this conversation is garbage. It's actually unusable. It's a dumpster fire. It's a hot mess. And it's creating less understanding of anti-Semitism, more censorship, and more division. So I wanted to find out why that had happened, and in the hope that we can put it right and create a more morally coherent and inclusive anti-racism.
Brilliant. And I think we promised tonight that we, out of the dumpster fire, we would be, yes, promising a very clarifying conversation. So it's what we're looking forward to. And I guess the first question really is, you mentioned the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and Aviva also mentioned it, of course, that is in the current context of Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. The question that we want to get straight to, I think, is firstly, why is criticism of Israel or Zionism not anti-Semitic? And secondly, why do so many Jews and others believe that it is?
Yeah, well, first of all, I do think that, by the way, I always find these mic setups quite oppressive to hand gesturing cultures. I feel like there has to be some kind of workaround. Anyway, I think that, look, it can be, right? Criticism of Israel and Zionism can be anti-Semitic, but it's not by definition anti-Semitic, and that's the way we've been encouraged to think of it. And I think, so one of the things I look at in my book is the idea that Israel, pretty much since the mid-70s, has been pursuing this agenda, and diaspora Jews around the world have pretty much fallen in line with, so this all goes back primarily to, there was a UNGA conference, a UN General Assembly meeting in the mid-70s, and they had a resolution about racism, including apartheid, including colonialism, and including Zionism, which they said was a form of racism. And this was, right, in the 70s, so after Israel, the Arab-Israeli War, in which Israel occupied Palestinian East Jerusalem, Palestinian West Bank, Palestinian Gaza, and Syrian Golan Heights. And by the mid-70s, there were already some decolonized countries that had a seat at the table and had something to say about this military occupation that Israel had done. And Israel looked at this resolution, and instead of thinking, well, wow, what is it that we've done to create this idea that Zionism is racism? Is it perhaps the military occupation that's the problem here? Instead of doing that, they said, no, the definition of anti-Semitism has changed. It is no longer about the individual Jew. It is no longer that idea that Zionism was supposed to eradicate anti-Semitism once Jews were regular folk with their own regular state. No, it's morphed. It is now criticism of the collective Jew as embodied by the state of Israel. And from that mid-70s point, we can see this trajectory over the decades where, you know, it was like a state project. Universities and think tanks and politicians all pulling in the same direction. And it had inflection points whenever there was criticism of Israel. It sort of rose, these accusations that such criticisms were anti-Semitic. So we saw it with the Lebanon War in '82. We saw it rise in the 2000s with the collapse of the peace talks and the brutal response to the Second Intifada, the apartheid wall that was set up, seizing giant chunks of the Palestinian West Bank. And of course, we've seen it go into overdrive in the last 22 months, where anyone calling for the slaughter in Gaza to stop is immediately decried as an anti-Semite. So that's the trajectory. And that's why we see it being used at such volume in this current moment.
Does that, so yeah, it leads neatly onto my next question, which is, I mean, at the Jewish Council of Australia, we get anti-Semitic emails, comments, messages on pretty much a daily basis. And but I guess one of the central premises of your book is still sort of a persistent question for us, and that is, given this sort of very widespread conflation, and given that Israel uses it as part of their propaganda efforts to sell their war, and that's picked up by organisations around the world, including in Australia, given the statistics that are often used for measuring anti-Semitism so often also include those anti-Israel or anti-Zionist incidents, and we get these, statistics about a 600% increase of anti-Semitism, etc. It's put out by the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. I mean, how do we, when there is that widespread conflation, how do we know that anti-Semitism is rising and becoming more serious? I mean, is it an issue that is confined to social media, the actual anti-Semitism, or is it sort of a wider social issue? And I mean, I won't get you to comment on the Australian case, but yeah, in the UK, what is the state of actual anti-Semitism?
I mean, it's a bit unfortunate, isn't it, that the compilers of anti-Semitism statistics are such unreliable narrators and have completely discredited themselves with this kind of conflation, because it makes it very hard for us now to get people to take it seriously. I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that anti-Semitism doesn't fit people's contemporary anti-Semitism doesn't fit people's understanding of what racism is in this moment, where we see it along a black-white binary and mostly showing up in structural, systemic ways, as we should, as we need to. But anti-Semitism doesn't really fit that category, and people have a hard time understanding how it's still relevant in the current moment. I can say that in the UK, the body that collates this information, when you drill down, they're not actually using conflated definitions for the kind of data that they have, and the data tracks with police data as well. And it is on the rise. It is objectively on the rise. It's mostly showing up in terms of hate crimes, so verbal and physical assault. People have been quite seriously physically assaulted, like bricks and bottles, and also desecration of Jewish buildings, schools and synagogues. And the other thing is that we had a survey a couple of years ago in the UK, and this tracks across Europe with a EU survey that shows that there is some structural discrimination against Jewish people, and it's showing up, obviously it's showing up towards people who are more visibly Jewish, or perceived to be more visibly Jewish, because, people get that wrong a lot, because racism isn't that sophisticated. Yeah, the discrimination was showing up mainly in areas like the workplace and education. And the EU report found that in most cases it was being underreported, so they're not being reported to police. So there is tangible data available on these things. But it is also true that, primarily, and Jewish leftists do this as well, there's this tendency to kind of not quite take it seriously, not least because there are more pressing racisms that are more overtly harmful in the contemporary moment.
Okay, yeah, we'll get into that one. I think the discourse around anti-Semitism, as you said, sort of exceptionalizes it. This is from, I think, there's confusion across the political spectrum, both from the right and the left. I think that on one hand, we have this idea that, and this is a quote from your book, by and large, white Jewish people don't face that kind of structural racism as people of colour. We don't have entire systems institutions, security forces, and other state bodies discriminating against us. And then on the other hand, we've got the right, who basically, I don't quite understand exactly what their theory of anti-Semitism is, except that it's connected to Israel, except that it's sort of a unique, ancient, sort of ahistorical, sort of forever form of discrimination and hatred, rather than one that's connected to racism. Or that is a form of racism. So how does it help us to view anti-Semitism as a form of racism? How are anti-Semitism and other forms of racism interconnected?
That's such a great question. And I think we do need to see them as interconnected. In my book, I have a couple of chapters on things that are happening with progressives, and a couple of chapters about Israel-Palestine, including what we just talked about and the way that Israel created this conflation, has been driving it so forcefully ever since. There's also a couple of chapters on the far right, because the far right is just all over the place with this. It's like anti-Semitic in forms of like straightforward white nationalism and Great Replacement theory, but it's also anti-Semitic. So quite often across Europe and the US, and actually you got your own variety as well, yay. You get the right wing claiming to be defenders of Jewish people and opposed to anti-Semitism. And they actually, the other thing that's making this conversation so complicated is that you can be as anti-Semitic as you please, as long as you are pro-Israel. And I refer to this as the practice of BB hugging. Like, you can say the most objectionable things, and then you rush off and have your photo taken with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he's shaking your hand, or you're giving him a bear hug, and it's like, I can't be anti-Semitic. Look, here's a picture of me hugging Bibi. So there's a couple of chapters on how that's completely distorted our understanding as well. But when I was researching my book, I did look at the history of anti-Semitism relative to other forms of racism. And it's just a reality that, and racism isn't a very original business. So racists are constantly cribbing notes, one from the other, and borrowing motifs, one from the other. And you can actually see this trajectory where, anti-Semitism in Christian Europe inspired, for want of a better word, the racism that produced race and was used to justify slavery and colonialism and empire for centuries. And then, it hops back and forth. So when Hitler was looking for a way to persecute Jewish people, he at some point looked at the Jim Crow laws in the US, which were basically a way of upholding white supremacy in the era after slavery, so a way of maintaining the discrimination of black people. And he ended up using a different variety, but he did kind of think, oh, America's democratic and racist. How do I do that? So you can see that they're constantly jumping one to the other. Scientific racism, which was the era, the Enlightenment thing of we have to find a sophisticated intellectual way of being racist, supposedly. So pseudoscience to justify racism. Jewish people, white-presenting Jewish people, confused the hell out of this crowd of like scientific racists, because they were like, well, you look white, but you can't possibly be white because we hate you, because you're not Christian European. So maybe you've got black blood. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe inside you're black. And they came up with all these ridiculous reasons. And so once you see that trajectory of all racism, it makes absolutely zero sense to be fighting these racisms in silos. We have to be doing it collectively, and unfortunately, we have to be doing that despite attempts by the political media mainstream to put hierarchies of racism in place and to pit one community against the other, which, by the way, very, very colonial era divide and rule vibes.
Yeah, well, speaking of trying to combat anti-Semitism in the silo, we were very happy that your visit to Australia sort of coincides with a big campaign that we've been running and others have been running around the response to the Special Envoy to combat anti-Semitism. who has put forth her own draconian Trumpian plan to, punish universities, punish charities, a sort of very punitive and exceptionalising plan to combat anti-Semitism, I think, with no particularly coherent understanding of what anti-Semitism is. It's so another two-part question. So what is wrong with the way that this plan tries to tackle anti-Semitism? And two, how have we seen similar plans internationally? How have they played out, this sort of authoritarian response to anti-Semitism?
Well, I can't speak to the specifics of Australia because that would be pretty imperious, wouldn't it? And you guys are going to know way more about that than me. But I can say that there are patterns, right? There are global patterns of behavior. And I look at what's going on here and I think, yeah, I've seen this before quite a few times now. We've seen this movie. And look, I think the important thing to say here is that clearly these are horrendous for free speech, absolutely appalling, primarily for Palestinians who are, through these laws, not able to describe in their own terms and their own words their experience of Israel and of Zionism, and for anyone who wants to support Palestinians in that struggle. So they're like the primary damage is done in that sphere. But it's also just a garbage way to be talking about anti-Semitism. Like if I genuinely, and this is how you know these people are fundamentally unserious and not actually interested in Jewish people and Jewish well-being at all. Because if objectively, if you wanted to tackle anti-Semitism, you sure as hell wouldn't go about it like that. You wouldn't create this definition and this sort of censorious definition that divided people, that produced hostilities and created less understanding of anti-Semitism as a result. And so I think we have to understand these moves. And yeah, there's a UK equivalent, there are equivalents across Europe, and you mentioned Trump, as like claiming to fight anti-Semitism is the cover story, right? It's the beard for these political actors doing things that they wanted to do anyway. And I'm not absolving the communal Jewish bodies that are steering or have a role to play in this and have been part of a catastrophic moral failure over Gaza that I don't even know what to say about it. It's such an epic failure of leadership, their responses to Gaza. So I'm not letting them off the hook. But a lot of these governments are pursuing policies that they wanted to pursue anyway, and they have found in anti-Semitism the perfect wedge, the perfect justification, the perfect cudgel to bash progressives with, while they introduce measures that, attack Palestinians, that attack critical race theory, attack Black Lives Matter, attack diversity and equity programs, and now, as we see in the US and in Australia, attack universities and cultural spaces. So I think that's the thing of, these actors are not serious about anti-Semitism. They don't really understand what it is. And we need to take that conversation away from them. We need to be claiming that space that tackles anti-Semitism and sees it as part of a coherent, joined-up struggle against racism and for Palestinian liberation.
That's brilliant. I think now I just want to turn the conversation to talk a little bit about the media's place in all of this. So a section of your book talks about the media storm around anti-Semitism during the Jeremy Corbyn years. And you have a couple of great quotes. I think these were my favourite quotes in the book, that from people that you talk to, which I think that many of us can relate to. So one is, I'd wake up in the morning and think, please no Jews on the front page. And then someone else says, Jews don't want to be obsessed over, not in good ways or bad ways. We like obsessing over ourselves, between us, but not being the centre of attention. end quote. So, I mean, the question is, why is the media so obsessed with us?
Why indeed? Why indeed? And that was this is a bizarre thing about all this, is that, you know, as part of that Corbyn cycle where, you know, day after day there'd be headlines about an anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party, which was just so distorted and hyperbolic, which, again, I'm not letting Jeremy Corbyn off the hook. He made his own mistakes, but the hyperbole around this issue was completely ridiculous. But you'd wake up and you'd see like all these commentators and you think, you've never spoken about anti-Semitism in your life. You've never spoken about racism in your life. And here you are claiming to know what it is and what it looks like and how we must be very serious about it. And it's just like, these people are not reliable narrators, right, on the subject. But again, they found themselves, because quite a lot of these people were, you know, right-wing or, you know, their near relatives, the the radical centrists, which I'm sure you have your variety of, they found themselves, again, the perfect wedge with which to attack the left. And I think this is also part of a configuration that we have to acknowledge, which the far right did play a hand in, but, you know, they had willing agents in the mainstream, that fundamentally this is a Islamophobic conversation. Because it's like, well, the Palestine solidarity left is mired in anti-Semitism, and part of the reason is because they're supposedly too lenient and accommodating of supposedly inherently, endemically anti-Semitic partners in the Arab and Muslim world. And this in itself is a sort of epic rewrite. I mean, it's kind of jaw-dropping for commentators located in Christian Europe to tell us that the problem is coming from mostly Muslim migrants. I mean, Germany with a straight face says that. And you're thinking, that's not, there's no self-awareness in this statement. But part of what we're seeing is that as well, and that explains the dominance, I would say.
Great. Right, I've got one last question. I'm just going to do a little time check, see where we got up to. I think running well. So if you haven't already, please Slido to put in your question, and we'll switch over to Q&A after my last one. So I want to talk about Jewish feelings. So Jewish fear in Australia is very real, amongst some more than others. And you have this quote from someone that you talk to in your book. So the quote is, "We need to sit down and explain why Jewish people are freaking out. To acknowledge that people may not be experiencing a threat, but that thing that they are bodily experiencing is real, and we're not going to gaslight them about it." So I do like that quote, but I guess the issue that I have, and I think the issue that maybe a lot of us people dealing with friends and relatives in the Jewish community over the past couple of years, has been the fact that the fear is real, but so much of that fear is in fact conditioned by anti-Palestinian racism. So many Jews are afraid of someone saying "Free Palestine," for instance, or are afraid of seeing just someone wearing a keffiyeh. So how do we balance it? How do we deal with those Jewish feelings?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I'm not sure I have the answers necessarily, but I can say, I mean, certainly this was something that, you know, because I hadn't really reported on this issue until our moment when anti-Semitism was in the news every single day in the, 2015 onwards, and obviously again in the last 22 months. I got to speak with a lot of British Jews, and, I'm Israeli-born, my family's Iraqi. I don't have that trajectory. I don't have that experience. And so I got to interview a lot of British Jews who could speak to, their families Eastern European Jews or European Jews who could speak to their family experiences, and both historically and sort of generationally with discrimination in the UK. And, you know, I did realize, like, that fear that I've seen take over people with is a trauma response, right? And I think we can't gaslight people about that. However, that trauma response has been completely commandeered to the most disgusting politics that we're seeing play out now, but have been for decades. And so, you know, I guess part of our work is to separate the two, of acknowledging, yeah, that is a trauma response, and then saying, but that doesn't justify the political response to that. It cannot justify that. And I think about it all the time, because I think now about, well, what are Palestinians in Gaza? What about their trauma response? You know, that's going to play for generation upon generation upon generation. People who've been orphaned, or people who've, you know, are amputees, with the largest population of amputees, or even, you know, people who've been starved, right? That's going to affect them bodily and generations to come. And Jewish people with histories in Europe know that intimately. And so, you know, I think quite often about, you know, what do we do with these trauma responses, right? And I think for progressives, part of it is acknowledgement, even if, but then stopping there and not allowing the political justifications that stem from that. And it's quite hard, but I guess, you know, we do have to offer people an off-ramp. They might not take it, but it's there.
I think that's a great answer. And I think it is part of what we are doing, trying to do with the Jewish Council of Australia, is offer that off-ramp, but without compromising our principles. So I'm now going to switch over to Slido and hope that this has all run smoothly. And it has. And and people have even upvoted for their favourite questions. So that is brilliant.
Such a sophisticated audience.
Thank you, everyone. I think that one... Oh, this is an interesting one. And I think goes to maybe a lot of the people in these rooms' experience. Do we need a word to describe Zionist hate towards Jews who support Palestine? Maybe a word. Is, I mean, I don't know if we need a special word, but what do we do?
Quite a few words.
Yeah, okay.
None of them are probably can't probably say any of them. Do we need a special word for that category of?
Or how do we deal with that intense Zionist hate towards Jews? I think who speak out, because that is, we do cop it.
Yeah, it's vicious, isn't it? I mean, as someone who was called an asshole by the British Board of Deputies, which was quite a moment, I can relate. Look, I think that the trajectory we're seeing, and it's not just Jewish bodies that are doing this, it's more widely Zionist bodies, because of course, you know, Christian Zionism, for instance, is way bigger. But a lot of non-Jewish politicians will describe themselves as Zionist and behave in these egregious ways. I think where we're at is they are moving Jewish away from being a marker of identity to being an ideology, right? And we just need to resist that with all our might. You know, my favorite version of this is the former New York mayor and Trump attorney and Catholic, Rudy Giuliani, saying about the billionaire financier George Soros, well, he's not really Jewish. I'm more Jewish than him. And you're like, that's not how it works. But that is how they would like it to work, right? Where Jewish is more a marker of ideology and more an indicator of do you support Israel or not? Because if you don't, you can't possibly be Jewish. And so I think we need to resist that with all our might. But what gives me hope in this conversation, and I don't know whether this tracks in Australia, but in the UK, Gaza has been such a fracturing moment for the British Jewish community. I mean, the fracturing has been happening for decades, but this has accelerated it. And there is just now a viable political constituency of British Jews who are not being represented by these communal bodies that claim to speak in their names and are actually reclaiming their Judaism and using it, like rooting their Palestine solidarity in their Judaism. And I find that really inspiring, and it gives me hope.
That's great. All right, the most popular question: how can Australian non-Jews fight real anti-Semitism, as in violence, neo-Nazis, etc., whilst avoiding support for narratives that delegitimise protests for Palestine?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I really appreciate that. And I think when I've been touring and traveling with this book, what seems quite obvious is that most people are in that spot of, yeah, of course we want to support our Jewish brothers and sisters. We also want to stand up for Palestinians, particularly in this moment, and we also want to be generally anti-racist. So how do we do that? Because this is really confusing, and it has been confused by political players. So, I think that's a really great question. And I do think it's also just a reality that we are operating in societies that are quite low literacy about anti-Semitism. And I don't mean that, I'm not wagging my finger. I think it's reasonable to suppose that that would be the case about all forms of racism. There's no way that we're going to pick up this knowledge unless we actively do it. And, many of us we're always going to be on that journey. People who look like me are always going to be on that journey when it comes to racism, when it comes to anti-Black racism and Islamophobia. It's a life's work. And I think the same goes for anti-Semitism, and just that understanding that, Christian Europe is the origin story for all these different kinds of racism. Use them in different ways at different times, targeting different people, but always for the same reason: to hold on to power, to extract wealth, to colonize, to dominate, and that involved persecution. And so just engaging with that and understanding the interplay of different racisms, including anti-Semitism, and adding that to our ongoing work of growing our awareness, I think is pretty key.
That's great. All right, this question is, I'm going to put my own, I'll read it and then I'll put my own spin on it.
Go on then.
Anti-Semitism drives support for the State of Israel. Subsequently, support for Israel drives further anti-Semitism. How do we stop the cycle? I guess my own spin on this is, what is the relationship between, are Israel's actions in themselves a driver of anti-Semitism, one? Do the pro-Israel organisations in the diaspora, their backing of Israel, does that in itself, sort of unconditional backing of Israel, does that drive anti-Semitism? And then I think the difficulty we always have with making that the Jewish Council making that as a clear-cut sort of argument is, we don't want to blame Jews for anti-Semitism, right? And we don't want to say that there's a rational aspect to anti-Semitism. But there obviously is a relationship there, and we do see one of the frequent email that we get now is, you're all Jewish people are baby killers. You're complicit. You're doing the genocide, and it's hard not to see that as being very directly that Israel's genocide is causing anti-Semitism.
Yeah, look, I think the bottom line is that anti-Semitism drives anti-Semitism. we're operating in societies that are, as we say, low literacy about what anti-Semitism is. And the reason it comes up when there are moments like this, moments of crisis, moments of catastrophe in terms of Israel's actions in Gaza and this genocidal war, is not because of that per se. It's because people are operating in societies where there are just ongoingly reservoirs of racism, deeply embedded in societies, including anti-Semitism, that become available and are reached for in moments of crisis. So that's why it's happening, and so it's not a rational response. It's coming up in these moments partly because, first of all, we're asking people to do a lot, in the sense of every morning we wake up and watch these just heartbreaking images in Gaza that are unbearable to see, just utterly grotesque, dystopian nightmare that won't end for Palestinians in Gaza. And the helplessness over not being able to stop that. We're telling people that Jewish people outside of Israel who have no say on Israeli politics and have no vote in Israeli politics cannot be blamed and cannot be held responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. And at the same time, we have these Jewish bodies who are very closely aligned and defend and support the actions of an increasingly far-right, fascistic Israeli government. And at the same time, people who want to cry out, go on marches or campus protests or whatever it is, are decried as anti-Semitic. And so it's a lot for people to unpack. And I think the main thing that we can do as progressive leftists who care about Palestine, not necessarily Jewish, but the main thing we can do is to debunk one of the biggest conspiracy theories at the moment, because anti-Semitism is at heart a conspiracy theory. The idea that, synagogues and the state of Israel are driving Western foreign policy. It's in this moment, that's the reach that a lot of people make. Like, how is this still happening? How is it that we cannot stop this grotesque onslaught? How is it that, the US president, the most powerful man in the world, Joe Biden, would say, oh, I keep telling Netanyahu to stop, but he won't stop. And that in itself is feeding conspiracies about Jewish people. And I think, our work is to locate this horrendous war in a geopolitical context where people can see, well, it's not actually just about Israel. It's about, this client state with a nation attached, this foothold in the Middle East for the West, this military-industrial complex that's driving the war, all the companies that the UN rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, pointed out in her recent document, who are profiting from the war, not just military companies, the intel, the security, a German chancellor a few weeks ago saying Israel is doing our dirty work for us. Kind of saying the quiet part out loud there. I think we just need to more widely permeate that understanding that might debunk some of the conspiracies that we are seeing all over social media, but actually I get them in conversation a lot as well. And it sounds like you get them mailed to you.
We do, but I should clarify that the vast majority of emails that we get are very supportive and are not anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
So yes, don't want to give that impression. So in your opening comments, this is another question that was upvoted. You were critical of the left. Can you elaborate, please?
Yeah. Well, I think it's understandable in this moment where, every effort that people make, whether it's marches, whether it's campus protests, whether it's the UN, whether it's the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, when anyone, dares to say, stop this slaughter, stop starving people, stop killing children, just crying out for it to stop gets accused of being anti-Semitic. It's a natural response for the left, for progressives, to push back on that. We have to, because we're in this moment of a catastrophe that's playing out every single day. We have to stand up against that. We also have to speak out when people are being censored and where there are real-life consequences to that, primarily for Palestinian voices, but also for others, where there's jobs and livelihoods and reputations being destroyed over it. So, of course, we have to do the work of pushing back on that. And at the same time, that can't be all we do when it comes to anti-Semitism. And that seems to be the trajectory that we're on. Like, the way we respond is mostly reactive. We are not this, we didn't do this, we should be allowed to do this. And that's necessary, but it can't be the only thing that we do. We need to be speaking about the dynamics of this, and we need to be speaking about anti-Semitism as well, and just reclaim that conversation that's been hijacked by the right wing.
I think this question is probably a bit of overlap, and I guess I'll put my own spin on it as well. So the question is, how do we have this conversation, by which I take to mean critical conversation about anti-Semitism, without centering Jews in the discourse about Palestine? So, and that is a big one for us at the Jewish Council as well. So the conversation seems to be about anti-Semitism. It's sort of been put there by our enemies in a lot of ways. What do we do about that, especially when we do want to fight back and we do want to put an alternative point of view, when it is particularly questions of anti-Semitism being misused to suppress the speech of Palestinians and to smear the Palestinian movement?
I mean, it's a great question. It's also in that paradigm of reactiveness, isn't it? How do we respond to the political misuses of anti-Semitism? And there's just this thing now where people are so sick of hearing about anti-Semitism because of the way it's being talked about. Not because people don't care about Jewish people. Obviously they do. It's because of the political misuse, the fact that it's just being politically misused to this degree. I've seen and heard variations of, people saying something like, if you haven't been accused of being anti-Semitic, you're not doing Palestine liberation right. You're not doing Palestine solidarity right, which is obviously not a position that anyone wants to be in, right? That's not the goal, for people to have that as the takeaway. And so I think, it's not a question of centering Jewish people. It's a question of understanding that our politics has to be morally coherent and cannot leave anyone behind, right? And of course, in this moment, the moral imperative is to stop a genocidal war. Of course it is. And at the same time, we do have to carve out some space to talk about the anti-Semitism that is real and is rising, so that we're not leaving people behind, so that we're bringing everyone with us, particularly in this moment where there's been such a fracturing in Jewish communities across the West. There's an opportunity here to pick up some more allies in this struggle. People are much more receptive to that than potentially they ever have been. I didn't just describe what's happening in Gaza as an opportunity, by the way. That's gross. So I don't want to be like, I feel like those two words were too close together. I'm just saying, in this moment, it's the time to speak genuinely, incredibly about anti-Semitism and tackle the real issue, as well as the fact that it's been distorted and politically abused.
I think this one would be good. I know that you've got a sort of section in your book about that goes into some of what you mentioned in terms of, I guess, the far right and the anti-Semitism brigade. I guess the other aspect of that I think is probably particularly strong in the US rather than necessarily in Australia or the UK, but is about Christian Zionism. So, yeah, how do we tackle that one? I mean, I do Having said that, in Australia we do have an interesting sort of anti-Semitism brigade that probably I'm not sure that everyone knows about, but it's called Never Again Is Now, and it's run by this Christian preacher character and his daughter, and it is very Islamophobic, and a lot of their base support is from these quite small evangelical Christian Zionist things. So they do have played their part. I mean, how do we combat them, I suppose, and how do we expose their anti-Semitism?
Yeah, that's such a great question. God, they're a nightmare, aren't they? The thing is, though, for Israel, they are much more important than Jewish Zionists in the diaspora. That's the reality. In fact, a former Israeli ambassador to the US said this out loud. He was in an interview, I think it was like, I want to say 2021, something like that. And he was saying, Christian evangelicals are like 25% of the US, but there's only 2% are Jewish. Like, we don't care. Be as leftist as you like. You're of no consequence. And you can see that actually in a lot of the language of Benjamin Netanyahu over the years, like not just now, but ongoingly. You can see that he's actually addressing a Christian Zionist crowd in the language that he uses. And also, he'll go around to all these sort of Christian Zionist conventions, like the big one in the US, which again is just like many, many, many times bigger than any Jewish Zionist organization in the US. So he goes to all these, one in the US, one in Brazil, wherever, and says, we have no better friends than you guys. You guys are our best friends. Israel's so lucky to have you. This is obviously his prime constituency. And it's just the reality of Israeli foreign policy now. You could say whatever, it's realpolitik, but they have placed the interests of, that would be a generous interpretation. You could say that they have placed the interest of Israel above everything else, including anti-Semitism, which explains the willingness of the far-right Israeli government to become best buds with these Christian Zionists who, their future scenario, end time scenario doesn't end well for Jews, right? It's blatantly like a large anti-Semitic theory. We'll become best friends and allies with them and with the far right more generally. So, Viktor Orban and Marine Le Pen in France and Viktor Orban in Hungary, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, all these blatantly, far-right leaders from parties with pretty anti-Semitic past and in some cases very much present, and is willing to ally with them because they support Israel. So there's a chapter in my book on each of those. There's one on Christian Zionism in and of itself, and there's one on the far right and what they're getting out of this relationship with Israel and what Israel is getting out of it as well.
I think this one is a really interesting question. So, do you think that Jewish people of colour face a level of discrimination that is greater than the sum of being Jewish or not white separately? So I think trying to say, is it compounding? Yeah, and can you tell us a bit about that, because I think that so often gets missed in discussions of anti-Semitism as well.
Yeah, completely. I really appreciate that question, because of course, we're talking about Jewish people and the trajectory of being absorbed into whiteness, and this was not the case for Jews of color Black and brown Jews, some Middle Eastern Jews as well. And I interviewed a few for the book, and I would say categorically that the sum total of the two forms of racism is greater. You know, they like the experience. One person described it as like being asked to pick a side, like, are you black or are you Jewish, and not seeing the two as inseparable, just an inseparable, coherent part of one's identity as a black Jew. And just coming into contact with that again and again and again. You know, this person, she just described it as exhausting and, you know, soul destroying. And it does seem like there's so much heavy lifting going on there with having to navigate people's weird preconceptions and bigotries on either side of that dynamic. That, yeah, absolutely, I would agree with the premise of that question. And I'm glad it was asked.
So this one is quite interesting as well. So in the US, AIPAC has bought politicians, yet here we don't have that overt system, and I would say in the UK, yeah, I would say in the UK as well, but correct me if I'm wrong. Right. So yet politicians and the media unwaveringly support Israel, and it is without an AIPAC here, without an AIPAC in the UK. The big question is why? Yeah,
it's a good question, and I think it confounds a lot of people. And I think the answer is multifold. You know, there are several layers. It's not one straightforward thing. AIPAC is a very effective lobby. Like any lobby, it lobbies very hard. It does it effectively. It does it, you know, well in its own self, you know, in terms of its own mission. And it is dominating one aisle of American policy, but it's politics, but it's not driving American foreign policy, and that's the distinction. There are various ways in which, you know, I think that a lot of what we're seeing is the renaissance of the neocons, who are like alive and well and dominating the conversation around justifying the invasion of Iraq, and had been so discredited in the years since Iraq and Afghanistan, with what happened in both those countries. So discredited that I kind of thought, oh, well, you know, they won't be able to make those arguments in public anymore. And yet, I think they are just alive and well and are driving a lot of these calculations and are alive and well in the establishment voices that actually are shaping different countries' national politics, regardless of which party is in government. And you just keep seeing glimmers of it, like, you know, the way that they were also enthusiastic about Israel's illegal attacks on Iran, for instance, the way that, you know, they're basically pretty happy at the idea that Israel would take out Hezbollah and Hamas. You know, you keep hearing people say, oh, shaping the new Middle East, you know, and you're thinking, what, this again? So I think there is just a current in Western politics that sees this alliance with Israel as necessary and important and useful. And, you know, you and I might objectively say that makes no sense. Like, the blowback will be horrendous. This is actually not a good foreign policy by any means, to have this appraisal of the Middle East and in Israel in particular. However, I do think that is the main driver in these countries, and that's why we're seeing such full-throated support.
So this one is a little particular, and I don't know if you have commented on this publicly before, so please forgive me. But you did sort of talk about, I guess, a particular, I think, phenomenon that is, I think it's worse in the UK than in Australia, which is the sort of radical centrist hot take brigade. And I think this one maybe falls into it, but let me know. What are your thoughts on David Baddiel's book, Jews Don't Count?
Well,
And you will need to explain who David Baddiel is, because I don't think that many people would know.
oh,
Yeah.
how to describe David Baddiel? It's a British comedian, celebrity, made his name talking about football, had a hit single, didn't he? About football? Should I be saying soccer to this crowd? Sorry. And he wrote a book called Jews Don't Count, which I always say could have been pretty much less objectionable with the title Jews Don't Count either. Because his whole thing is, everyone has all this awareness about other racialized minorities, but not Jews. And it's like, have you spoken to any black and brown people in the UK? Because that's not what you're going to hear. Like, that is far from what you're going to hear about who counts and how. I think the only thing I can diplomatically say is that when my book came out towards the end of last year, I did an event with like a Jewish progressive organization in the UK, Na'amod, who have been present at all the Gaza marches. They have their own, block. And their numbers have increased over the last 22 months. And they've been doing amazing work. And someone came up to me at the end and bought several books. And he said to me, "These are Hanukkah presents for all the members of my family who made me read Jews Don't Count." And I just thought, yes, my work is done. That's all I'm going to say.
Okay, I'm very glad that I asked that question. Brilliant. So I think this might sort of wrap us up for the evening. And I think it is something that you have definitely touched on before, but it was a popular question. And I think hopefully it'll give you a chance to restate and conclude the discussion for tonight. So, how do we move away from treating anti-Jewish hate as requiring a special or unique status, and instead understand it within a universal framework of racism?
Yeah, that's such a great question. The special status is horrendous. It's so divisive and disruptive, and is actually producing less awareness of anti-Semitism. I think that's, it's important we keep saying that. It's important we keep taking that away from, people who claim to be tackling anti-Semitism. They aren't, and they can't with this approach that they're taking. So I think that, and it does create this perception of hierarchies, that there are hierarchies, that governments care more about one type of racism than the other. And it's actually worse than that. Certainly in the UK context, governments are reproducing anti-black and Islamophobic racism while pretending to be fighting against anti-Semitism. I mean, pretending, it's not very generous. I'm sure they mean well. Dramatic pause. So I think that, the more that we become informed about different kinds of racism, and the more we understand actually how contemporary anti-Semitism works, because I don't think it's bad faith when people say, and some Jewish people say the same thing, I don't think it's bad faith when people say, well, how does that work? How does anti-Semitism show up today in a post-World War era where, there has been a trajectory of Jewish people, white-presenting Jewish people, being absorbed into the category of whiteness, Western whiteness. And that's seen as a success story, right? Particularly in the US. How does anti-Semitism fit in to our understanding of this world and the structures of racism? I think that's a good faith question, and we're able to answer it in good faith. So I just think it's hard to be doing this work despite the garbage conversation that's been put out in the political and media mainstream. We're having to have this conversation despite that, and instead of it, and it's just really difficult. It's genuinely really difficult, and it's going to take a long time. But I don't see any alternative other than we have to do it. Anti-Semitism cannot be tackled separately and specifically. It can only really be understood and challenged and debunked and disrupted in alliance, in an anti-racist alliance that is genuinely building solidarity across different minoritized, different racialized minorities and what they're experiencing today. And it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same, but it's also not a competition. And we have to find ways to be in alliance with each other while also upholding our commitment to solidarity with Palestinians.
Brilliant. That is a great place to end it for tonight. So please join me in thanking Rachel. Thanks so much, Rachel. That was a really amazing conversation. And as I said, yes, we have the same dumpster fire of a conversation going on in Australia. And I think your book, your tour here has, I think, offers us really, really valuable and important tools in our fight. So thanks from all of us at the Jewish Council of Australia and more generally as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And thanks for all the amazing work you're doing as well.
Thank you. So Rachel's book is for sale up the back, and she will be sticking around for a little while and signing books. The other things that I have to mention is that there will be members of the Jewish Council of Australia at the national rallies for Palestine solidarity with Gaza on this Sunday, August 24th. I believe it's happening in all capital cities, and the one in Melbourne is just right there at the State Library of Victoria at 12 o'clock, so please join us there. And otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone.